Kaserne vor dem großen Tor stand eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. So wollen wir uns da wiedersehen, bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen.
The Allied defeat of the elite Africa Corps led to the decision to ship thousands of German prisoners of war to the United States. This decision both avoided the logistics problems of feeding and housing large numbers of prisoners in a war zone and supplied labor desperately needed on American farms and ranches. Eventually, 4 German POWs from the North African and European theaters of war were interned on American soil. The Kansas POW experience represented a cross-section of the total American story. The important part of that story was the change in the lives of the prisoners and Kansans in ways that neither of them anticipated. The experience of capture was imprinted on the memory of every POW. Gerd Kruse, a former POW in Kansas who now farms in Deschler, Nebraska, recalled the facts of where and when he was taken prisoner.
I was captured in Bizerte in Africa, 1943, May the 9th, 12:30 noon.
He described feelings that were typical of many German soldiers.
No, I think it was an awful feeling, to you just abandon your motherland and you go to a different country. You don't know what could happen, but what's up, It's a funny feeling.
Immediately after capture, prisoners were subjected to a thorough search for weapons and marched off to distribution centers. Conditions in these centers were often harsh, with little water and no sanitation facilities for as many as 30,000 men. Souvenir-happy American GIs routinely relieved the German POWs of watches, pens, cameras, and medals. After a cursory interrogation, the prisoners went to embarkation points at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, their boarding ships for the journey to America. Life aboard ship in most cases was good. On some ships, in fact, the prisoners ate ice cream, slept in cabins, and played shuffleboard. Some American newsmen made accusations of coddling. The POWs landed at either Norfolk, Virginia, or Camp Shanks, New York. Some of the more zealous expected to see New York City in rubble from Luftwaffe raids. After a hot shower with good smelly soap, shots, and delousing, the men were ready for the trip west. In Germany, soldiers often rode in boxcars. In America, they rode in upholstered coaches and were served sandwiches and coffee by black porters. One prisoner remarked, "Many anti-American feelings disappeared on the trip to Kansas." Security on the trains was tight. Windows locked, location signs removed from depots. The guards were told, "Don't be cruel, but hard-boiled." When finally the POWs arrived at their camps, whole towns turned out to see the Germans in their short campaign pants, khaki uniforms, long-billed caps, and goggles. The POWs who alighted in Kansas were surprised not to see buffalo and Indians. They found themselves at Camp Phillips in Salina and Camp Concordia. These stark new facilities were among the largest POW compounds in America. Frank Carlson, former Kansas governor and U.S. congressman and senator, explained the selection of the Concordia campsite.
Someone in Washington had suggested, I assume, that Concordia ought to be checked, and they did come in here and check the area. And it was determined by the War Department itself that this would be a good location for a prisoner of war camp. The location was good, and no problems with a good Wi-Fi, some good land that seemed to fit for the War Department, and it was for that reason there was no problem about getting it established here.
Attitudes of the residents toward the decision were mixed.
We had many people that wanted this camp established because it was a remunerative operation for a business and the location, and I didn't get too much complaint from the general public. The city of Concordia, for instance.
Employed by the Corps of Engineers during camp construction, Beryl Ward explained the opposition mentioned by the senator.
I think it was probably just fear of the unknown. They were afraid there'd be escapes and there would be problems arise for the town people. And of course, some of them had sons in service, and I think they were ones that didn't look too kindly on having prisoners around here.
Complaint about the camp disappeared almost completely when public fears proved baseless. Rapidly constructed camps Phillips and Concordia began to receive prisoners in 1943. With a capacity for 3,000 POWs, Phillips was smaller and its life briefer than Concordia. The latter was a small and self-sufficient city for the 4,000 POWs and guard garrison housed there. Many civilians from the nearby area also worked at the camp. Located north and east of Concordia, the camp was on a large tract of land with a slight grade and encircled by a high barbed wire fence and guard towers. Only a few physical signs remained to mark the campsite, including a restored guard tower, storage sheds, masonry work, the officers' club, and a water tower that dominates the country scene. The camp was laid out with the military affinity for square corners. Street names such as Lee and Grant commemorated American war heroes. Within the camp complex were scores of barracks, mess halls, workshops, libraries, clubs for officers and enlisted men, athletic facilities and a hospital, post office and post exchange. Although Camp Phillips had a fairly placid history, Camp Concordia was in disorder until a new commander in late 1943 infused discipline in the American Army unit and ended Nazi control of the POWs. A small Nazi corps intimidated the mass of POWs who were patriotic but unsympathetic to fascism, and apparently drove some of them to suicide. Using information probably obtained from anti-Nazi prisoners, the military police raided the compound, pulled the incorrigible Nazis from the ranks, and shipped them to an Oklahoma camp. POW escape attempts were few and always ended in failure. No person was endangered in the incidents, and they often had a humorous side. One officer got out of Camp Concordia unnoticed and made his way a few miles to Belleville. While in uniform, he casually bought a railroad ticket at the depot and had breakfast at a restaurant. He was arrested only when the waitress became suspicious because he seemed unfamiliar with the money. A tragedy, both by American and POW accounts, occurred at Camp Concordia when a guard shot and killed a prisoner in the fire zone along the fence when he tried to retrieve a soccer ball during a game. The POWs thought that the shooting was murder, and the rumor spread among them that the guard had bragged earlier that he would kill a Nazi. Their resentment was natural, but malice was not proved in the guard's court-martial. This episode marred an otherwise exceptional record of the American military and its relations with the men they guarded. Perhaps friction between guards and POWs could not always be avoided, but American personnel treated the POWs correctly and carefully followed the Geneva Convention. Gerd Kruse concurred in regard to treatment he received.
I think it was good. It was good. So I cannot complain. Cannot complain at all. I think it was good overall to speak, and it was a good treatment.
For guards and POWs to become friendly was common, and guards often overlooked minor prisoner violations of camp policy, especially their manufacture of schnapps. Civilian employees at the camps frequently did not know what to expect from the POWs. Bernadine Cummings, who worked in the transportation office at Concordia, described her first meeting with the prisoners.
My first encounter with the prisoners at the camp was when they came in to get a drink of water in the wing of the building where I was at. And I was a little apprehensive at the time, not knowing what to expect of them, because they came in and they looked at me and they clicked their heels and saluted, and I couldn't figure out what that was all about. And
the Americans liked the POWs' work ethic, politeness, and good humor. They also found mutual interests and attitudes with the POWs that led to friendships. Such was the experience of Mrs. Cummings.
my relationship with most of the prisoners that I worked around was very congenial. They were people just like you and I. They all had feelings. They all had concerns about their families back home and whether they were alive or what was happening. And they were just normal people to be around.
The policy at Camp Concordia was to keep the POWs active. They had a wide variety of jobs in the camp. They worked at construction and maintenance, had office assignments, and ran many of the shops. The POWs gave the camp much of its attractive appearance, and Army reports described Concordia as a beautiful facility. Attractive gardens and neat lawns could not conceal that Concordia was a POW camp, but they provided it with an unexpected aesthetic quality. Prisoners planted Chinese elms in straight rows along the post-entrance road. Mature trees now marked the camp spot, together with rock walks built by the POWs that now wind through yards and fields. Skilled at masonry, the POWs constructed a fence at the camp entrance that still stands. Manually adept, the prisoners used scraps, surplus materials, and original ideas to turn plain building interiors into attractive and colorful rooms. Small officers' clubs, decorated and called casinos, were talked about throughout the area. POWs used their leisure time for physical activity and athletics, to acquire and practice hobbies, to read, study, and take academic courses, to present and attend cultural and entertainment events such as band concerts, including those by the Africa Corps Band, and to publish a camp newspaper. The prisoners, especially the officers at Camp Concordia, were well educated, and this was reflected in their pastimes. Painting and drawing were popular activities, and the creations of the POWs ranged from rudimentary to highly professional. The POWs sold and gave to civilians their artwork as well as their carvings, models, and toys that they made from bits of wood, metal, and cloth. Looking toward the end of the war, some prisoners made toy trains, animals, and cars to take to their children, whom many of the men had never seen. American authorities encouraged both self-study and organized education in the camps. The library at Concordia had more than 7,000 volumes and was considered one of the best collections in Kansas. The POW University of Camp Concordia was organized, and its structure and curriculum paralleled those of the civilian institution. POW officers were the instructors of courses that ranged from beginning English to technical medical subjects. The university had substantial enrollments, and the instructors always knew where their students were. Some of the prisoners eventually earned academic credit through the POW University. One of the controversial issues in the POW program in America was the attempt to ingrain democratic values in the prisoners, a practice that raised many ethical questions. Military authorities at Concordia tried to influence the POW attitudes through regulation of the materials they could read and movies they could watch, such as The Keys of the Kingdom. Many prisoners, however, were receiving an education in democracy that was more effective than any official program could have been. They were learning about democracy from their contact with Kansans, especially outside the barbed wire in communities throughout the state. The simple presence of German prisoners in camps in Kansas would have been of little significance for the region had not the prisoners had the opportunity to meet Kansans. That opportunity, however, was abundant, mainly because, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, the United States Army used prisoners to alleviate the wartime labor shortage. The work performed could not be directly related to the war effort. Enlisted men among the prisoners had to work if so assigned. Officers worked only if they volunteered to do so. Although in other areas of the country, and to some extent in Kansas, POWs performed industrial labor, in Kansas they mostly did agricultural work under a system coordinated through the State Extension Service. Farmers and county agents who believed that the agricultural labor shortage was acute enough to justify it could request the establishment in their locale of a branch camp filled with POWs to work for nearby farmers. Sometimes the local farmers formed special associations in order to assure reasonable accommodations and orderly employment for them. From Camp Phillips and Camp Concordia, and from base camps in Colorado and Nebraska, prisoners and guards dispersed to branch camps scattered across Kansas, including areas of German-American concentration in the south-central and north-central parts of the state, where citizens could converse with the prisoners in their own language. Farmers who wished to employ prisoners came to the branch camps before 8 in the morning and picked up POWs, generally in groups of 4, whom they were to return to the camp by 6 p.m. Farmers were advised to work alongside the prisoners, to give them rest breaks, to have other farm hands dress in another color besides blue, since the POWs were to wear blue, and not to let the prisoners operate power machinery, but some did. Written guidelines cautioned, do not enter into general conversation with the prisoners, and by all means do not discuss anything of a political nature, especially anything concerning the war. But some did. Most of the wages paid by farmers for prisoner labor went to the Army, but the POWs received a percentage that they might spend at their camp canteens. The facilities available for branch camps varied among the localities. In some places, such as Lawrence, the prisoners lodged at least temporarily in tents. In others, such as Council Grove, old civilian Conservation Corps camp buildings were reactivated to house prisoners. In still other locations, POWs occupied business buildings right downtown. In Peabody, they were in the Eystone building, a 2-story brick structure. The Army put bars on the windows, which still remain, and erected a cinder block wall around an exercise yard. Security for prisoners on work details was strict at first, with watchful guards accompanying each group of prisoners. Thereafter it loosened. Often the prisoners worked without guards, or if present, the guards were relaxed. Ernest Claassen, one of the farmers who employed POWs near Peabody, observed this easing of vigilance.
The guard was out there with the 4 prisoners. They were working in the field, and it was a long day and nothing for the guard to do, so he finally lay down under a tree and went to sleep. And as we were working, they saw the American lieutenant coming from the camp in Peabody on an inspection trip, so they very quickly woke up the guard so that he could be guarding them properly when the lieutenant came around.
The only fears remaining were those of the uninformed or self-serving. Individuals in Newton, for instance, complained to the United States War Manpower Commission that POWs employed in the American flour mills were likely to put arsenic or glass into flour at the mill, presumably because some of the flour was going to Russia. Such incidents could not sour good relations between Kansans and the POWs, relations strengthened by daily association and by hard work side by side. Although prisoners were supposed either to return to camp for lunch or to carry their lunches, many farm women fed them at their own tables. Others took them to cafes. Recalled Wilafred Goedecke, whose parents operated a cafe in Portis and fed prisoners,
my mother prepared a family-style setting for anywhere up to a dozen or more men. To enable them to enjoy their dinner without being stared at, my parents served them in our living quarters. My parents prepared food for the enemy and tried to make them as comfortable as they could. My brother was the same age as some of those boys.
Sometimes distressed by what they considered wasteful American methods and occasionally disgusted by American tastes, the prisoners despised corn at the table, considering it fit fare only for hogs. Still, the Germans were impressed by the productivity of American agriculture, and they worked hard, stacking hay, spreading manure, sowing wheat, shocking wheat, digging potatoes, plucking chickens, blocking beets, clearing brush, and perhaps worst of all, shocking and threshing Kaffir corn. Threshing Kaffir under the Kansas sun, Ernest Claassen recalled, even inspired one POW to verse.
Of course, this was in German, and I guess they got rather tired of this continual work. It'd be windy and dusty and not always pleasant, and so one of them, he made a little rhyme. In German it was Gott schuf Menschen Affen Tiere und in seinem großen Zorn schuf Kansas und das Käferkorn. Translated, that would be, God created men, apes, other animals, and in his great wrath he created Kansas and the Kaffir corn.
The POWs were most impressed, though, by the kindnesses and general good treatment they received from Kansans. Mrs. Isabel Balzer, whose husband Charles employed many prisoners on his farms near Concordia, recalled an encounter with prisoners who asked to tour her home after dinner.
After they finished, by their officer, the guard of the day, asked if I would mind them walking through our house to see an American home, and I said no, they were welcome to. And as they walked through the front room, this one prisoner took his hand and just pulled it along the piano keys, just like you'd touch something that you liked. And I said, does he play the piano? And he said, beautifully. I said, would he like to? So he said, oh, he'd just love to. So he sat down and played a pretty waltz and different things, and just said thank you after he got through.
Two prisoners later presented Mrs. Balzer with paintings they completed in Kansas, but could not carry home with them. Kansans, for their part, were pleased with the men who worked as prisoners among them, especially with their industriousness. Witness the testimony of Dick Holmquist of Smolin, who employed POWs from Camp Phillips to clear brush.
I gave them axes and saws and a jug of water, and they went to work. And they were woodsmen, every one of them. And they trimmed out to nothing. And I told them to stop that. And I come out there with a tractor a day later and pushed the big brush together in a big pile, and I set fire to it. Then they just shook their head. They said that was the most wasteful thing they'd ever seen. Because back there, I think they burned the leaves even.
Or Charles Balzer.
Well, I got along with them real good, and the men that, the American men that were working for me, they got along with them. And they were anxious to get out of the camp out there, to get out and get some exercise and all, and they'd tell you they could do this and do that, where they had no experience with it, but they'd try, and they were not lazy. They would work, and because if they didn't, then all you had to do is turn their name into the camp out there, and they wouldn't get to come back on the job again.
Or Ernest Claassen.
They were simply my kind of people. Felt they were people there, they were out there to work, they were willing to work. I could, since I knew German well, I could converse with them very well. Enjoyed working with them.
When World War II ended, the Kansas POW camps gradually closed, and the last prisoners left the state in 1946. It was a long time, however, before many of the POWs reached home. Some of them were delayed at Camp Eustis in Virginia to receive political indoctrination. The prisoners called it a shot of democracy. These POWs were eligible to work for the American occupation forces in Germany. Less fortunate POWs were detained a year or longer in Great Britain and France. The eventual return of the POWs to their ravaged country did not end the story of Stalag Sunflower. The POW experience permanently changed the attitudes and lives of both the prisoners and Kansans, and those changes influenced their respective societies. Relationships between Kansans and the POWs generated goodwill that helped to erase the bitterness of war and set a policy of friendship between the United States and West Germany. Kansans were repulsed by Nazism, but they judged the POWs as human beings, independent of the official philosophy of the state they served. Kansans who knew the POWs were not interested in the punishment of a people for the excesses of their government. They wanted a just peace and leniency toward those Germans who were not Nazis, which became the American policy toward the defeated nation. German POWs received perhaps the most humane treatment of captives in modern warfare. It was an exceptional example of decency in a war of unparalleled inhumanity. A former prisoner wrote Virgil Lundberg, commander of Camp Phillips.
These last few months were the best time I have ever had, and I remember them often. When I talk to my parents about housing, food, work, entertainment, and so forth, they're very glad that I've had such a good time, and that their worrying was just for nothing.
Few POWs were uninfluenced by what they heard and saw in Kansas. They were exposed to beliefs and practices highly divergent from their own society. Not all POWs came to believe in democracy, but enough became familiar with it to contribute to its successful practice in West Germany. As captives, they learned the rudiments of democracy and advantages of freedom. War usually pulls people apart, but World War II drew the POWs and Kansans together. Friendships between them have continued to the present. Regular correspondence between former POWs and Kansans crosses the Atlantic with recollections, but also with news about children and grandchildren, and the joyful and less joyful events of life. Some Kansans and former prisoners have visited each other. These reunions have brought them even closer, and even have been occasions for community celebrations. America has been a symbol of opportunity to which even the POWs were not immune. They returned to Germany, but to some of them, the lure of America became stronger. Heinrich Goedecke was a POW at Concordia, and his widow, Frieda, reflected on why they left their land to become immigrants and then American citizens.
But my husband really did like it here, and he said there's lots of room to live and there are opportunities to make something out of yourself there. So this was more or less the reason to come, and then the freedom, and he thought for our children it would be good to come here.
What they had seen, faith in themselves, led them to pursue the American dream.
We've been here since 1952, and we accomplished a lot. We came with 2 suitcases and 2 boxes, and today we have a house, and we have a manufacturing company, and we have a retail store, so we can't put that in 2 boxes in a suitcase anymore. And you can do it here in America. I think that's the only place where you can do it.
Vor der Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor, stand eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. So wollen wir unser Wiedersehen, bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen. Aus dem stillen Raume, aus der Erde Grund, mich wie im Traume dein verliebter Mund. Wenn sich die späten Nebel drehen, werd ich bei der Laterne stehen, wie einst Lili Marleen, wie einst Lili Marleen.